the origin of the people. It all begins with a voice no one else hears, an invisible whisper that crosses deserts, survives the night, and embeds itself in the mind of a man named Abram. It is the beginning of a story that will stretch across more than 3,000 years, cross empires, oceans, and mountains, and endure persecutions, expulsions, betrayals, and wars. But in this moment, everything is still. A lone man, under the open sky of Mesopotamia, hears an impossible promise. Leave your land, your family, and your father's house, and go to the place I will show you. You will be the father of a great nation. You will be a blessing. There are no crowds or miracles at that beginning, only an inner act, a step, a silent renunciation. Abram leaves Ur of the Chaldeans, a city that was brilliant and powerful for its time, and ventures into the unknown with his wife, his nephew Lot, his livestock, his servants, and a strange unheard of faith in something he himself cannot name with certainty. At a time when every tribe worshipped its own local gods, shaped from stone, clay, or wood, this man begins to speak to an invisible being, without face, without temple, without name. Something that cannot be touched, not even imagined. A God who is not of this world, but sustains it all. The journey takes him to Canaan, an arid land occupied by peoples who look at him with suspicion. No thrones or crowns await him there, only the repeated promise, like a persistent echo. Your descendants will inhabit this land, even though your wife Sarah is barren, even though old age has already settled in their bodies. And yet, they wait. They build altars. They call upon this new God. At times they doubt. At times they bargain. Abram even argues with him, demands justice, asks for explanations. And there begins something that will forever shape the identity of the Jewish people. The relationship between the human and the divine is not one of blind submission, but of dialogue, of tension, of constant seeking. It is not about obeying without question, but about walking while doubting, about moving forward even in darkness. Time passes. They change camps, travel to Egypt during a famine, return, dig wells, negotiate land, avoid conflict with other clans. There is no great military epic, no resounding conquests. What there is the patient construction of an identity that is not yet known as such, a story that does not yet recognize itself as a story. Only when God makes a formal covenant with Abram, changing his name to Abraham, father of multitudes, does the narrative begin to solidify. The covenant is strange, deeply symbolic. Animals are sacrificed, flesh is divided, commitments are sealed in blood. But the essential part is invisible. It is an eternal alliance, where God promises to give Abraham's descendants a land, an inheritance, a mission. And Abraham promises faithfulness, not just for himself, but for all who come after him. Sarah, incredulous and aged, hears one night that she will have a child. She laughs, but the laughter is part of the miracle. From that laughter, Isaac is born. His name means exactly that, he who laughs. There is nothing solemn about this birth. There is humanity, tenderness, surprise. And there is also tension, because the story of Abraham carries an inevitable wound. His other son, Ishmael, born of Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian slave. The decision to send him into the desert, separated from his brother, marks a rift that will extend through the centuries. The narrative does not hide contradictions, errors, or injustices. There are no perfect heroes here. There are difficult decisions, like taking Isaac to Mount Moriah, ready to sacrifice him by divine order, until an angel interrupts the act and reveals the true meaning of the test. Faith is not to kill. faith is to trust beyond the absurd. Isaac grows and has 2 sons, Esau and Jacob, and the cycle repeats. Tension between brothers, the parents' preferences, disputes over blessing. Jacob deceives his blind father, takes his brother's place, and flees. His life is a constant going back and forth between guilt, fear, and the search for reconciliation. Along the way, he has a vision of a ladder that connects heaven and earth and wrestles all night with an angel until he receives a new name, Israel, the one who wrestles with God. That name will forever mark the people who will come from him. They will not be the ones who believe without thinking, but those who argue, question, reason, those who do not accept silence as an answer. A people unafraid to wrestle even with the sacred. Jacob has 12 sons. From them, the 12 tribes will emerge. One of them, Joseph, is the favorite, and this leads to his brothers hating him, selling him into slavery, and sending him to Egypt. But his story does not end there. Because in Egypt, Joseph will interpret dreams, save the kingdom from famine, and become a figure of power. Years later, he will reunite with his brothers, forgive them, and invite them to live with him. It is a tale of reconciliation, of cycles that close, of destinies that seem fragmented but end up intertwined. And yet, what seems like a resolution becomes the beginning of a long shadow. Because that arrival in Egypt, seemingly providential, is the first step toward a new chapter, slavery. But we are not there yet. Before that, something more important happens. The emergence of a collective identity. Until now, we have seen individuals, patriarchs, families, personal stories that connect with the divine. But as the children of Jacob multiply, as they settle in foreign lands, the concept of a people begins to be born. Not just a shared genealogy, but a common memory. A hope passed down from fathers to sons, from mothers to daughters, in stories whispered under the stars. The story of the Jewish people does not begin with a flag or with a border. It begins with words, with promises, with silences full of meaning. It is a story woven in the slowness of time, in patient waiting, in contradiction. And it is precisely that mix of faith, struggle, error, and vision that makes it so deeply human. It is not born from an act of strength, but from a silent decision to trust in something greater. Something that is not yet seen but intuited. Something that burns without consuming. This first chapter ends with a family that has grown, settled, and survived jealousy, internal exile, spiritual trials, and emotional reunions. But what comes next will be different. Because when the story spans generations and settles in foreign lands, a new cycle begins. What was once a blessing will become a threat to the powerful. And thus, without yet knowing it, this people is about to enter one of its darkest chapters. Slavery under a pharaoh who no longer remembers the name of Joseph. The 12 tribes of Jacob. The echo of the covenant continues to vibrate through the family's story, but now that echo spreads across new generations, less aware of their origin, yet already burdened with the silent inheritance of something that has been taking shape from afar. The story now shifts toward Jacob, the youngest son of Isaac, the one who wrestled with an angel in the middle of the night and was transformed into Israel. His life is complex, marked by decisive encounters, escapes, deceptions, and redemptions that intertwine like the invisible threads of a still incomplete tapestry. But the core of this stage lies not only in Jacob as an individual, but in his sons. 12 men who represent 12 futures, 12 open paths toward what, over time, will become a nation. Jacob, also known as Israel, has children with 4 different women. That complex family structure, far from being a mere anecdote, will become a constant source of internal tensions. The emotional hierarchies are clear, painfully clear. Rachel, the beloved wife, dies young, but leaves 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin, whom the patriarch views with a kind of affection that unbalances the entire family structure. The other sons perceive this, and they suffer because of it. And in that atmosphere of quiet competition, of growing rivalries, a tragedy as old as humanity itself begins to unfold: the envy between brothers. Joseph, the second youngest, grows up surrounded by privilege. He is intelligent, sensitive, and has strange dreams that he recounts with a certain innocence, unaware of how this isolates him from the others. In one of those dreams, he sees himself as a central figure, surrounded by 11 stars bowing down to him. And even if dreams are symbolic images, his brothers interpret it as a direct threat. Who does this dreamer think he is? What is that boy in the colorful tunic trying to prove while we work under the blazing sun in the fields? The decision to get rid of him does not come all at once. It is an accumulation of resentments. They catch him in an open field and throw him into an empty pit. They consider killing him, but in the end they decide to sell him to a caravan of merchants heading to Egypt. They take Joseph's bloody tunic to Jacob, pretending that a wild beast devoured him. The lie is cruel, and the wound it leaves in the father never truly heals. Meanwhile, Joseph descends into an entirely new world. Egypt is the most powerful empire in the region. Its culture, its religion, its architecture, its politics, everything about it is vast, sophisticated, magnetic. There, Joseph moves from being an anonymous slave to a falsely accused prisoner, and from prisoner to dream interpreter for the pharaoh. His gift for uncovering hidden meanings in dreams turns him into an indispensable figure. He warns of 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. The pharaoh, impressed, grants him the authority to manage the kingdom's reserves. Suddenly, the young man once despised by his brothers becomes the right hand of the most feared throne in the world. The years pass and the famine spreads, just as he had predicted. Even Canaan suffers from the drought, and Jacob, now aged and broken by the loss, sends his sons to Egypt in search of food. What follows is one of the most intense episodes of the entire biblical account: the reunion between Joseph and his brothers. They do not recognize him, but he recognizes them. He bides his time, confronts them, tests them. He wants to know if they have changed, if they are capable of protecting Benjamin, the only brother from his same mother, the new favorite of their father. The tension grows with every scene. There is no direct revenge, but there is a search for truth. Joseph needs to see that the hatred that once threw him into the pit no longer controls their hearts. And when he confirms it, when he sees that they are willing to sacrifice themselves for Benjamin, he breaks inside. He weeps. He reveals himself. He opens his arms, and the past, so full of shadows, becomes a possibility for forgiveness. Jacob is brought to Egypt. The entire family accompanies him, a tribe already numerous. They settle in the region of Goshen, and for the first time, the descendants of Abraham inhabit fertile land, protected under the wing of a foreign power. Jacob dies. Joseph dies. A cycle comes to a close, and what remains is an invisible but powerful structure. 12 distinct lineages, each with its own temperament, its own mark, its place within the group. Levi will become associated with priesthood, Judah with leadership, Benjamin with resilience. The seed of the tribes has already been planted, although their consolidation will come later, through struggles, conquests, and long migrations. For now, it is a budding identity. There are no laws yet, no defined territory, no army. Only a shared memory and a common sense of belonging that begins to pass from generation to generation. However, not everything is stable. Something is shifting in the background. The death of Joseph, who was the direct link to Egyptian power, marks a subtle but crucial turning point. Years go by, rulers change, official memories are rewritten. And one day, a new pharaoh looks at the descendants of Jacob, now a growing population within his kingdom, and feels fear. He does not know Joseph, owes him nothing. He only sees a foreign group multiplying too quickly, preserving its own customs, not fully dissolving into the local culture. And fear, as always, becomes an excuse for oppression. The tribes are no longer free. They become laborers, useful pieces of a political machine that needs to build cities, store grain, raise monuments. What began as a gesture of family salvation slowly becomes a trap. The initial hospitality turns into slavery. The identity that had begun to take shape around the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph will now be tested in the cruelest possible way. But before that trial, the echo of the stories that gave them form remains. The names of Jacob's sons still resonate like deep roots. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Each one represents a distinct branch, a specific memory, a destiny in potential. The people do not yet know what awaits them, but they have already been marked. By pain, yes, but also by dreams, by mistakes, and by the capacity to forgive. And by that persistent will not to disappear, even when everything seems to push them toward oblivion. The next stage will be different. It will no longer be about family conflicts or sibling rivalries. Now, history will drag them into a much greater struggle, against an empire that will show no mercy. And in that context, a figure destined to break the chains will emerge. Though his birth is still in the future, the desert is already waiting for him. Slavery in Egypt. For a time, life in Egypt seemed stable. The 12 tribes, still in formation, prospered in the land of Goshen, far from the center of power, but within the reach of the most solid empire of the ancient world. That lineage, born from nomadic shepherds and shaped by dreams and betrayals, had found refuge in a fertile land. It was a tense calm, a pause in the middle of a story that never truly rests. Because while Jacob's family grew, new generations were born who did not know Joseph personally, and a new pharaonic dynasty was rising, one that did not remember the gestures of gratitude nor the silent agreements that had once offered them hospitality. In the oldest scriptures, it is mentioned simply, "A new Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph." That brief sentence contains an abyss. From indifference to fear, there is only one step, and from fear to absolute domination, none at all. The Hebrew people who had settled as guests came to be seen as a foreign body, as a silent threat that grew with every birth, with every tent that was raised, with every dialect that refused to dissolve into the language of the temples. What was once voluntary labor turned into formalized slavery. They were no longer shepherds with a unique story. They became forced laborers serving a machine that allowed no dissent and no foreign roots. The orders began. The construction of entire cities, warehouses, canals, fortifications. The sweat of the Hebrews was absorbed by the Egyptian land as if it belonged to it by right. There was no option to protest. Bodies were broken, but so were the inner stories. Each blow, each day under the scorching sun of the Nile, cast doubt on the validity of that ancient covenant, the promise of becoming a great nation, the hope passed down from mouth to mouth since Abraham. Where was the God who had walked with their ancestors? In what part of the sky was justice hiding? And yet, children kept being born. Hebrew women gave birth with a strength that unsettled the Egyptians. Fertility became another reason for fear. The Pharaoh, trying to stop the demographic growth of the enslaved people, issued a monstrous order. All newborn males were to be thrown into the Nile. Water, a symbol of life in Egypt, became an instrument of death. But the story takes a turn at its darkest point. A woman, unnamed at first, hides her son for 3 months. When she can no longer protect him, she places him in a basket woven with reeds, covered in pitch, and sets it afloat in the murderous river. The child does not sink. The current gently pushes him toward the Pharaoh's daughter, who finds him, adopts him, and gives him a name, Moses, which means drawn out of the water. Destiny has its way of mocking power structures. The one who should have died in the river will be raised in the very palace of the oppressor. Moses grows up as an Egyptian prince, surrounded by luxury, trained in the language and science of his captors. But something inside him is torn. There is an invisible thread pulling him toward the enslaved people. One day, he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and reacts. His anger drives him to kill the oppressor. He can no longer stay. He escapes to the desert of Midian, where he changes his life, marries, becomes a shepherd, and tries to forget who he was. Years later, when the memory of Egypt seems distant, the impossible happens. In the blazing silence of the desert, while tending a flock, Moses sees a bush burning without being consumed. The fire does not destroy. It is another kind of fire. And from that fire, a voice calls him by name. It is the voice of the same God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. It calls him, asks him to return, to liberate his people. Moses hesitates, as real men do. He is afraid. He considers himself slow of speech. He does not feel worthy. But the voice does not yield. It gives him an unheard of name. I am who I am. No further explanations. It is the beginning of a radical revelation, of a language that does not fit into previous molds. Moses returns to Egypt accompanied by his brother Aaron. He presents himself before the Pharaoh with a proposal that seems absurd. Let my people go. The Pharaoh laughs. Who is this God the fugitive shepherd speaks of? What right does a slave people have to demand freedom? But what follows is not a plea. It is a series of signs, each more intense, each harder to ignore. The Nile turns to blood. Frogs invade homes. Dust becomes insects. Each plague is a crack in Egypt's power system, an affront to its gods, a sign that history has become uncontrollable. The struggle is not only physical, it is theological. Egypt represents order, permanence, absolute control. The God of Moses represents the unpredictable, the living, that which manifests in the small and disarms the immense. The Pharaoh's resistance is not just stubbornness, it is a symbolic war over the meaning of the world. And when the final plague arrives, the most brutal one, which takes the lives of the firstborns, Egyptian resistance shatters. The Hebrew people prepare in haste, with unleavened bread with blood on their doors. That night, something new is born. Freedom has not yet been achieved, but the soul of slavery has been defeated. The people leave, and that act, to leave, is as simple as it is profound. To abandon the place where one was born, to walk into uncertainty, to trust that there is something beyond suffering. That is the true beginning of the nation. There are no armies, no thrones, no palaces. Only a multitude of freed slaves, with deep scars and a memory that is still learning to remember itself. The desert awaits them, but they do not yet know how long the journey will be. The only thing clear is that Egypt is behind them, and with it, the old world. From this moment on, the story will no longer be told as that of a family or a tribe. It will be the story of a people who are beginning to exist as such. A people who will have to discover what it means to be free, what to do with that freedom, and how to keep alive the flame that once began in a bush that burned without being consumed. Moses and the Exodus. Leaving Egypt was not simply the abandonment of a physical place. It was a total rupture in the fabric of time, a rewriting of destiny at the moment when a multitude of slaves, worn down by generations of oppression, dared to take the most difficult step of all, to walk into the unknown. The account does not dwell on logistical details, does not list supplies or provisions, because the essential is not material. What truly happens is that the collective soul of a people awakens for the first time, and with it, a will is activated that had been dormant since Abraham. Freedom, that word that seems so abstract when one lives in chains, becomes tangible with every step upon the sand. The night of the Exodus has no parallel. It is a night charged with tension, with cryptic instructions, with symbols that would be repeated for centuries. A lamb is sacrificed, its blood painted on the doorframe of each house, the meal eaten standing, with staff in hand and heart pounding. It is a dinner of urgency, of farewell, of beginning. The Hebrews do not flee like fugitives, but march with a deep sense of destiny, as if they knew that in that gesture something far greater than themselves was being sealed. And while the Egyptian homes sink into mourning, a multitude walks away beneath the moon, silent but awake. But freedom is not granted without resistance. The Pharaoh, defeated but not resigned, changes his mind. He gathers his army, his chariots, his crushing military power, and sets out after them. The scene that follows has been told for millennia, repeated in songs, dramatized in rituals. Moses, leading the people, reaches the sea. Behind them, death gallops in the form of swords. Ahead, the water appears to be the end of the road. It is at this physical and symbolic limit where the unthinkable occurs. The sea opens, the waters part, and through that impossible passage, the people cross on dry ground. The place of chaos becomes a path of escape. The obstacle becomes a road. When the Egyptians attempt to follow them, the sea closes. What once was power sinks without a trace. This moment is not a trick nor a geological feat. It is a foundational gesture. From that point on, they are no longer just a group of clans with a shared story. They have become a new entity. The sea does not only divide them from Egypt, it divides them from their past. What remains on the other side is not slavery, but possibility. But that possibility comes at a price. Because freedom, when it is real, demands learning, discipline, transformation. The desert stretches before them like a blank page, a brutal and vast space where everything is a test. There are no crops, no cities, no shade. There is heat, wind, and above all, the constant temptation to go back. Because in the desert, one cannot live on nostalgia, and that hurts. Soon the complaints begin. There is no water, no bread, no meaning. Why did you take us out of Egypt? Did we not at least have food there? Freedom does not fill the stomach, and idealism wears out under the sun. But in the midst of that frustration, events occur that shape the heart of Jewish identity. The manna appears in response. Each morning something like dew covers the ground. When gathered, it becomes food. It cannot be stored. It rots if saved. The message is clear. Trust each day. Learn to live without accumulating, without controlling, without long-term planning. Water flows from a rock. The path is traced step by step. There is a pedagogy of the desert that teaches what no city ever does. To walk without certainties, to follow a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And then the story pauses. The multitude camps at the foot of Mount Sinai. Something is about to happen that has no precedent. It will not be a private vision, nor a coded message. It will be a collective revelation. The mountain trembles, the sky rumbles, and the voice that spoke to Abraham, that burned in the bush, now addresses everyone. The words do not come in the form of cold laws, but of living principles. You shall not kill. You shall not steal. Honor. Respect. Keep the day of rest. Love. The message is not only vertical, from man to God, but also horizontal, from man to his fellow man. Here is born a code that does not depend on temples nor priests. It is a code that each one carries within, written not on stone, but in the conscience. But while Moses remains at the top of the mountain, something breaks below. The people, impatient, demand an image, a form, something visible. Aaron, under pressure, gathers gold and builds a calf. They dance, they celebrate, they seek security in the tangible. And when Moses descends, the scene he finds is devastating. The covenant has been broken before it could be sealed. He shatters the tablets. The wrath of God is fierce. But Moses intercedes. He pleads. He stands in between. There is punishment, yes, but also forgiveness. And with that gesture, the relationship between the human and the divine enters a new phase. It is no longer unilateral. There is dialogue. There is tension. There is a kind of love that is expressed through conflict. The years that follow will not be easy. The people continue walking, sometimes with hope, sometimes with frustration. They complain, they rebel, they ask for meat again, they look back, they doubt. Moses ages along the journey. His patience wears thin. And although he remains the mediator, the leader, the prophet, he knows that he will not enter the promised land. That is a bitter reality, but a deeply revealing one. There are those who open paths they will never walk themselves. Their role is not to arrive, but to make it possible for others to arrive. And so the march continues. Through the desert, through the years, through contradictions. Each day brings a lesson, each mistake a warning. What is being shaped is not just a free people, but a responsible people. A people who carry on their shoulders not a fulfilled promise, but one that must continue to be fulfilled. When the borders of Canaan finally begin to appear in the distance, the story prepares for another turn. Moses looks from above at the land he will never step on. But his words, his gestures, his struggle remain imprinted in those who will cross. Because true legacy is not measured in kilometers traveled, but in the fire that remains lit, even when the harshest winds blow. The journey through the desert. The desert is not just a geography, it is a state of the soul, an intermediate station between what once was and what is not yet. For the people who left Egypt, the desert represents a threshold, a space where everything before has been left behind. Slavery, humiliation, forced obedience. But where what will make them a nation has not yet fully emerged. It is a long, harsh, and seemingly unproductive transit. But in that apparent emptiness, the deepest things are forged, collective consciousness. At first, there is a natural exhilaration. The newly gained freedom brings a vibrant euphoria. The people sing, led by Miriam, sister of Moses, beating her tambourine in the sand. The sea has closed behind them, and Egypt lies buried in the silence of the deep. For a few days, the feeling of victory gives them strength. But the desert soon reveals its true face. There is no water. There is no shade. The sun falls like a sentence, and provisions run low. The feeling of abandonment grows, and with it, the questions, the complaints, the nostalgia. Was this what we left for? Was the bread of slavery not better than the hunger of freedom? The divine response does not take long to arrive, but it comes without noise. Each morning, on the dry ground, a strange, fine, whitish substance appears, which, when gathered, becomes food. It is manna, a kind of bread that cannot be stored for more than one day. If anyone tries to keep it, it rots. No accumulation is possible. It is a direct and harsh lesson, to learn to trust without reservations, to live according to need, to understand that each day has its own demands, that survival is not an act of calculation but of constant connection. Water, when lacking, flows from a rock struck by the staff of Moses. Everything essential is there, but nothing is given in advance. The people used to living under the whip must now learn to live under uncertainty. As they move forward, they stumble again and again over the old reflexes of fear. Every time they feel exposed, they look back toward Egypt, as if the memory of chains offered more comfort than the discomfort of freedom. That constant tension, the urge to move forward clashing with the desire to return, becomes the true conflict of the desert. It is not the distances, it is not the enemy tribes, not even scarcity. It is the mind that has not yet fully understood what it means to be free. Because freedom is not a fact, it is a process, and that process is painful. In the midst of this journey, a key moment occurs: the encounter with the law. Moses climbs Mount Sinai, where he receives the stone tablets with the commandments. But what he receives is not just a list of rules. It is a moral architecture, a model for living in community, for honoring others, for recognizing the sacred even in daily life. It is no longer the time to follow a single leader. Now is the time to build a culture based on words, on justice, on respect. Meanwhile, down below, the people panic over the absence of Moses. They demand from Aaron a visible God. And he, yielding to the pressure, gathers the gold from the necklaces, melts it, and forms a calf. They dance, sing, and lose their way in a matter of days. When Moses comes down with the tablets and sees the calf, he smashes them to the ground. It seems like an act of fury, but it is, in fact, deeply symbolic. One cannot receive sacred law while idolizing comfort. Forgiveness will take time, not come automatically. The tablets are rebuilt, but the damage leaves a mark. Every step taken from that point on will be followed by warnings, instructions, and reminders. It is not about instilling fear, but about forming a conscience. The desert is the stage for that formation. Over the years, systems are established, structures, detailed norms for living together, for worshiping, for resolving conflicts. The people who left as an unformed mass of slaves gradually transform into a community with codes, with responsibilities, with a sense of time that no longer depends on agricultural seasons or the Egyptian calendar, but on their own festivals: the Shabbat, the Passover, the harvests, the Day of Atonement. Each date is a sign that they are ceasing to be subjects and becoming authors of their own story. The desert is also a stage for rebellions. On several occasions, groups rise up against Moses and Aaron. The figure of the leader is not unquestionable. There are disagreements, disobedience, confrontations. Some end with exemplary punishments, others with reconciliations. But in all of them, lessons are learned. One learns that a community is not sustained by miracles, but by commitment. That the promised land is not a gift, but a responsibility earned over time. Moses, who guides, intercedes, defends, and punishes, grows old with the people. His figure is that of a tired but lucid father who knows every weakness of his people but does not abandon them. He himself makes mistakes. There is a moment when, pressured by the people's thirst, he strikes a rock in anger instead of speaking to it as instructed. That act, seemingly minor, will cost him entry into the promised land. But his punishment is not a defeat, it is a lesson. Even the greatest of leaders is not above the law. After many years, 40 according to tradition, the new generation is ready. Those who left Egypt have died along the way. Their children born in the desert, raised under the cloud of Sinai, formed without nostalgia for slavery, are the ones who will cross the Jordan River. They will inherit the promise, not because they have more merits, but because they were born without chains in their minds. And so, the desert is left behind. But its lesson remains. Because what was lived there was not just a passage, it was a foundation. There, the character of a people who still have no land but already have a soul was forged. A people who learned that freedom is not escape, but daily construction. That the most sacred food does not fall from the sky without conditions. And that great promises are not fulfilled immediately, but step by step, to the rhythm of dust, of wind, and of the voice that never stops speaking, even if it speaks from silence. And now that the land appears on the horizon, with its walled cities and its fields yet to be conquered, another kind of story begins, where what has been learned must be put into practice in the face of challenges very different from those of the desert. The conquest of the Promised Land. The land does not appear all at once. It first hints at itself as a distant line on the horizon, a silhouette taking shape through the desert haze, like a mirage that has waited entire generations to become real. That land, first mentioned to Abraham when he had no descendants, now returns to the center of the story as a promise finally within reach. But it is not a gift that falls from the sky. It is an occupied territory, alive, with peoples, walls, kings, and customs deeply different from those the Hebrews learned in the desert. The transition will be profound. Going from a nomadic life, guided by heavenly signs and constant miracles, to a settled existence upon the land, will require a kind of courage very different from crossing seas or surviving in the arid wilderness. Moses dies without setting foot on it. He says farewell from the top of Mount Nebo, seeing with his eyes what his feet will never touch. And his absence marks an inevitable change in leadership. Command passes to Joshua, a man of quiet but firm character who has been beside Moses since the early days, observing, learning, waiting for his moment. He does not have the same charisma, nor the same direct contact with the divine, but he has something essential for this new stage: the ability to act with precision on the ground, to move between strategy and faith. Crossing the Jordan River is the first concrete step toward conquest. The people stop at its banks, and once again, the water becomes a threshold. When the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant touch the riverbed with their feet, the waters recede. The multitude crosses on dry ground, as had happened with the sea. It is a symbolic repetition, a way of marking that this new chapter has the same spiritual legitimacy as the previous one. Upon reaching the other side, a massive circumcision is performed. Many of those born in the desert had not yet been marked. It is a rite of passage, a renewal of the covenant, a way of saying that the story is starting again. And then, war. Because the Promised Land, no matter how fertile, is inhabited by peoples who do not expect to be displaced. The first great city to fall is Jericho. The account preserved in the texts is not that of a conventional siege. The people circle the city for 7 days, in silence, blowing ram's horns at the end of each lap. On the 7th day, they shout, and the walls fall. It is an episode filled with symbolism. The power lies not in brute force, but in precise obedience to a logic that escapes military understanding. Jericho falls not because of the army's size, but because of the echo of an order beyond the walls. But not everything is victory. There are mistakes, there are defeats, there are internal betrayals. In Ai, the second city they face, the people suffer a bloody setback because one among them had taken spoils from Jericho, breaking the strict prohibition against keeping the enemy's goods. The story does not forgive deviations. The war for the land is not an imperialist conquest in the style of the great ancient kingdoms, but a deeply moralized process. Every step is under scrutiny. Every disobedience brings consequences. Joshua leads campaigns for years. Some battles are fought openly, Others are resolved through pacts or cunning. The Canaanite peoples, organized in city-states, confront the Hebrew advance with resistance, but also with fear. Some, like the Gibeonites, seek alliances. Others dig in. The biblical narrative emphasizes that these wars are not arbitrary, that a judgment hangs over these lands, a kind of moral reckoning that is settled through the Israelite advance. But it is important to understand the tone in which it is told. There is no gratuitous glory, no flawless heroes. There is tension, dilemmas, contradictions. The process is complex, full of moments of uncertainty and difficult decisions. When the campaigns conclude, the territory is divided among the 12 tribes. Each one receives a portion with precise boundaries, designated cities, grazing areas, and sacred zones. But the occupation is neither immediate nor complete. Some enclaves remain under the control of the previous peoples, and in some areas, integration will be slower. The ideal of a fully unified land is not achieved in this first stage. The map is left scattered with latent tensions that, in the following years, will erupt into internal conflicts, disputes over resources, and tribal clashes. The conquest of Canaan is not, then, a single act or an instant triumph. It is a prolonged process, full of nuance. And the people, newly settled, must learn to live with everything that entails, defending their borders, resolving civil disputes, keeping alive the memory of a covenant that, amid stability, runs the risk of growing distant. Because the greatest danger does not come from external enemies, but from forgetfulness. From the possibility that new generations, born already in the land, take for granted the freedom, the inheritance, the identity. That is why there is insistence, again and again, on repeating the stories, marking the days, passing on the account. The Ark of the Covenant is placed in a fixed location, and although there is not yet a temple, a sacred space is established. The festivals are organized according to the agricultural calendar, but anchored in the experiences of the desert and the Exodus. Every harvest, every rain, every vintage is an opportunity to remember that this land, however fertile it may seem, is not just a resource. It is a legacy. And like every legacy, it demands responsibility. In that context, the figure of Joshua begins to fade. He fulfills his mission, distributes the land, calls the people to a final assembly, repeats the commandments, renews the covenant. Then he dies, and with him disappears an era of centralized leadership. What will come is a new stage, more fragmented, less predictable, where each tribe will live according to its own dynamics, exposed to external influences and internal weaknesses. But before entering that stage of uncertainty, it is worth pausing to reflect on what this conquest meant. Not just the occupation of a space, but the crystallization of an ancient promise, woven with words and kept alive for centuries. Now the land is beneath their feet. But the deepest challenges will not come from the outside. They will come from within. From the way each generation succeeds or fails in remaining faithful to a story that began with a voice in the desert, and that, as we will soon see, still has much to say. The time of the judges. When Joshua dies, the structure that had maintained a certain order dissolves silently. There are no successors with his authority. There is no coronation, no leaders appointed by consensus. The tribes, now scattered throughout the territory, face a new and complex reality. The land is occupied, yes, but not completely. There are still active Canaanite enclaves, neighboring peoples with whom they trade or fight depending on the mood of the moment. And above all, there is a clear absence of unity. The generation that lived through the desert has vanished, and the one born in the promised land has not had to fight for it. They inherited it without having endured the journey, and what is inherited without effort is often forgotten easily. The period that opens at this point has no official name, no established form of government. It is a time of chronic uncertainty, of intermittent chaos, where each tribe lives according to its own rhythms and priorities. The biblical text describes it with a phrase that echoes like a dark refrain. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what seemed right in their own eyes. That apparent freedom, far from being ideal, turns into disorder. The shared identity begins to fade. Some groups adopt religious practices from neighboring peoples. Improvised altars are built. Strange cults are tolerated. The bond with the God of Sinai, which had been central during the journey through the desert, becomes blurred, sometimes ceremonial, other times completely absent. But the cycle repeats itself. When the people forget their history and scatter into comfort or indifference, external dangers quickly emerge. Hostile tribes, armed incursions, sudden raids. Poorly defended borders become vulnerable areas. And it is at that moment, just when the danger becomes unbearable, that an unexpected figure arises. Not a king, not a general, not a priest. It is someone chosen suddenly, often in contradictory ways, almost always unforeseen. A judge. The word judge in this context does not refer to someone who applies laws in a courtroom. It is a broader, more ambiguous figure, combining military leadership, moral authority, and social charisma. There are no dynasties. There is no planning. Each judge appears as a response to a specific crisis, acts for a brief period, leads a liberation, and then disappears. No heirs are left behind. No institutions are founded. It is a fleeting yet intense figure that emerges when the people are on the brink of collapse and need to remember who they are. Among these judges, there are names that stand out for the intensity of their stories. Deborah, for example, is a female prophet who leads a tribal coalition against a Canaanite oppressor. Her presence in the narrative is powerful. She sits beneath a palm tree, settles disputes, and guides men into battle without lifting a sword. Her song, one of the oldest texts in the biblical corpus, celebrates not the victory of the strong, but the awakening of those who are asleep. Gideon, on the other hand, is a timid farmer who receives his calling while secretly threshing wheat, afraid of the Midianites. At first, he hesitates. He asks for signs. He demands certainties. But he ends up leading an offensive with only 300 men, intentionally reduced so that no one could attribute the victory to numbers, but to the cause. His story reflects the ongoing tension between personal insecurity and the possibility of fulfilling a destiny beyond oneself. And then there is Samson, the most enigmatic of all. A man of overwhelming strength, a Nazirite from his mother's womb, destined to fight the Philistines, but trapped in his passions and contradictions. His story is not that of an exemplary leader. It is the story of a tragic man, impulsive, seduced by a woman who betrays him, blinded, humiliated, and finally redeemed in a final act that blends vengeance and sacrifice. The life of Samson is not a model to follow, but it serves as a mirror for a people who, during that time, swayed between excessive strength and lack of vision. Between one story and another, the pattern repeats. The people lose their way, forget, blend with foreign customs, fall under oppression, cry out for help, and a judge emerges. There is something profoundly human in this cycle. It is not a tale of moral perfection, but of downfall and recovery. The people are not idealized. They are fragile, contradictory, often ungrateful. But what keeps them alive is their ability to return, their inclination to go back, again and again, to that original voice that called them from the desert. But the fragility of this system is evident. There is no continuity. Each generation seems to start from scratch. What is learned is not clearly passed on. And although the stories of the judges are striking, none manage to stabilize a lasting order. Over time, the external threats become more persistent. The Philistines, in particular, consolidate as an organized enemy, with superior technology, a strong coastal presence, and a culture that increasingly challenges the very existence of the Hebrew tribes. It is then that the people begin to look toward the political models of their neighbors. Spontaneous judges are no longer enough. They no longer want to depend on fleeting appearances or isolated charisma. The desire arises to have a permanent figure, a king, someone who can unify, give shape, and impose order. That desire, which grows slowly, will become an open demand. And that demand, as we will see later, will not be received enthusiastically by everyone. The time of the judges, with all its rawness and contradictions, represents a key stage in the evolution of Israelite identity. It is the moment when the tribe faces the dilemma of cohesion, how to remain faithful to a common heritage without dissolving into the surrounding peoples, how to resist without becoming what they are fighting, how to lead without losing the essence of the covenant. The answers are not yet clear. What is clear is that the people are about to cross a new threshold in their history, a threshold that will forever change their way of governing, believing, and fighting. Because the figure that is about to appear will no longer be a judge, but someone who represents the desire for permanence, for centrality, for indisputable authority. Although that desire, as so often in history, will come with new questions, new risks, and new conflicts. The division of the kingdom. When the people asked for a king, they did so out of exhaustion, out of weariness, from that human longing for visible order, for clear structure, for a figure onto whom they could project hopes and responsibilities. And although that desire was initially met with hesitation, even with prophetic warnings about what concentrated power entails, it was ultimately accepted. What began with Saul was consolidated with David and magnified with Solomon, seemed to be, at least for a time, the climax of the collective story. A unified city, a majestic temple, an organized court, a respected kingdom. Everything was, at last, in its place. But in human history, the moments of greatest brilliance often contain within themselves the seed of collapse. Solomon, with all his wisdom, with all his international prestige, with all his administrative capacity, was also the one who led the people into a silent internal tension. Taxes increased. Monumental works demanded constant labor. And perhaps most delicately, there was a growing fascination with the outside world. The king married foreign princesses, built altars to foreign deities to satisfy political alliances, and diluted the spiritual center of the kingdom in a web of ambiguous commitments. What had once been a faith carved in stone during the desert began to be covered in unnecessary ornamentation. When Solomon dies, the kingdom appears, on the surface, stable. But that stability is superficial. His son Rehoboam ascends to the throne without charisma or intuition. And when the northern tribes ask for tax relief, when they plead with him to ease the burden his father imposed to sustain the splendor of the kingdom, he responds with arrogance. He refuses to yield. He speaks harshly, as if the power he inherited belonged to him by divine right and not by a delicate political balance. The result is immediate. 10 of the 12 tribes break away, step aside, group under new leadership, and found a new kingdom, Israel, the northern kingdom. Rehoboam is left only with Judah and Benjamin, and Jerusalem, though sacred, is reduced to the capital of a diminished territory. Thus is born a fracture that will last for centuries. Two kingdoms with a shared root, but with different policies, different alliances, and even religious narratives that begin to diverge. In the north, with its capital in Samaria, the new king Jeroboam fears that his people, by continuing to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem for the festivals, will emotionally return to the old order. So he decides to build his own places of worship. He installs golden calves in Bethel and in Dan, symbolic replicas that evoke ancient idolatrous practices. In doing so unknowingly, he institutionalizes not just a political separation, but a spiritual one. The northern kingdom, broader in territory, more fertile, more exposed to international trade, is also more vulnerable. It enters cycles of instability, with kings who rise and fall abruptly, with palace coups, with dynastic changes that weaken any sense of continuity. Some attempt to restore order, others plunge into corrupted religious practices. Despite certain moments of prosperity, the North gradually drifts away from the original ideal, and with it, the bond with that common memory that once united the tribes under the narrative of the Exodus and the Covenant also weakens. In Judah, things are not necessarily better, but they move more slowly. The Davidic line continues, sometimes by mere inertia, other times through a genuine attempt at reform. Some kings seek to return to pure monotheism, destroy idols, cleanse temples, and call the people to renew their relationship with the law. But every step forward is followed by a setback. The tension between the sacred and the political is constant. Meanwhile, neighboring empires, Assyria to the east, Egypt to the south, and later Babylon, watch these small kingdoms with a mixture of contempt and opportunity. The prophets emerge as key figures in this period. They are not fortune tellers, nor mystics, nor decorative figures. They are uncomfortable, critical voices that appear in the plazas, at the temple gates, in the middle of assemblies, to denounce injustice, empty worship, corruption, and inequality. Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, Micah, each in his time, in his region, brings an urgent message, sometimes poetic, sometimes heartbreaking. And although many are ignored, marginalized, or persecuted, their words remain recorded, sown like seeds of a consciousness that, centuries later, will germinate once more. The division of the kingdom is not a simple geopolitical matter. It is a deep wound in the history of Israel, a sign that even chosen peoples can break, can err, can lose their way. The Promised Land, once dreamed of as a space of unity and harmony, has become a stage for rivalries, intrigues, and distances that are not only physical. Each kingdom accuses the other of betrayal, of deviation, of impurity. And meanwhile, the external threat approaches with firm steps. Because while the Hebrew kingdoms dispute internal legitimacy, Assyria expands with military precision and known brutality. In less than a generation, it will erase the northern kingdom from the map. Samaria will fall, the tribes will be scattered, exiled, absorbed by other cultures. History will remember these 10 tribes as lost, as fragments that never returned, as echoes of an interrupted past. In Judah, the news of the North's fall will be received with fear, but also with a certain arrogance. Many will believe that Jerusalem cannot fall, that the temple will protect them, that the line of David is inviolable. But history does not favor the overconfident, not even those who wear a crown. Thus, the division of the kingdom reveals itself not as an accident, but as a warning. A sign of what happens when identity is no longer sustained by blood, nor by borders, not even by symbols. It is sustained by fidelity to a shared vision, to a profound ethic, to a collective consciousness that must be nurtured generation after generation. And when that consciousness weakens, even the strongest walls crack from within. In that context of unresolved tensions, with a weakened South and a vanished North, a new stage will begin. One that is more bitter, darker, but also more revealing. Because when the land is lost, the true value of what truly endures is tested. And what was to come would once again put to the test the essence of a people who refused to die in the midst of exile. The destruction and the exile. When the dust of Samaria settled and the gates of the northern kingdom closed forever, history turned its gaze to Judah with a mixture of warning and patience. The southern kingdom, smaller but still standing, watched its brothers fall and knew, at least on the surface, that it was no political coincidence. The prophetic message had been clear. Without justice, Without ethics, without a living memory of the covenant, not even the most sacred walls offer salvation. Yet the warning did not translate into structural reform. Judah continued on its path with a dangerous mix of trust in the temple and negligence toward the values that the temple was meant to embody. For a few years, there were kings who tried to repair the spiritual fracture. Kings like Hezekiah and Josiah carried out deep reforms, tearing down idolatrous altars, restoring the reading of the law, reminding the people that the alliance with the God of the desert could not coexist with idolatry or social indifference. But the reforms were inconsistent, sometimes superficial, and often reversible. Each new monarch meant a change in direction, a regression, an opening to syncretism or authoritarianism. Stability was an illusion, and while the people lived under the apparent protection of the Temple of Jerusalem, the empires continued expanding their maps of conquest. Assyria, which had devoured the north, began to lose strength. And in that power vacuum, Babylon emerged, more ambitious, with better organized armies, and with a different strategy. They were not satisfied with military victory. They wanted psychological control, a complete reconfiguration of the conquered territories. Judah found itself caught between this new monster from the east and the strategic movements of Egypt, which still sought to maintain influence in the region. Between poorly calculated alliances and unrealistic rebellions, the kingdom weakened from within. It was then that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, set his sights on Jerusalem. The first incursion was controlled, measured. A vassalage was imposed, and members of the elite were taken to Babylon. Young nobles, skilled artisans, scribes. Among them, figures who would later shape Jewish thought in exile. But the punishment was not immediate. It was meant as a warning. However, instead of submitting, Judah once again defied its new overlord. And then came the final blow. In the year 586 before the Common Era, Jerusalem was besieged. After months of hunger, desperate resistance, and broken promises, its walls gave way. The Babylonian army entered the city, destroyed its buildings, desecrated its sacred places, and set fire to the temple. That temple, built by Solomon, a symbol of unity, the spiritual center of the people, was reduced to ashes. The sacred columns, the altar, the ark, if it was still there, disappeared in the chaos of the assault. The flames destroyed not only stone, but a worldview. The city was devastated. The remaining elite, along with much of the active population, was chained and taken to Babylon. What remained in Judah was merely a handful of peasants, the elderly, and a few who adapted to a new colonial order. The Promised Land, which for centuries had been the physical heart of Israelite identity, was lost. And with it collapsed the question that had sustained the people until then. Who are we when we no longer have land, nor king, nor temple? That moment marks a radical transformation. The exile in Babylon was not just a geographical deportation. It was an existential fracture. Those who had been raised in the certainty that Jerusalem was inviolable, that the covenant with God guaranteed protection, found themselves in a strange land, beside unfamiliar rivers, speaking a foreign language, surrounded by gods with other names. Longing turned into hymn. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion, says the psalm. But tears, however deep, could not last forever. At some point, they had to rebuild. And so it happened. In the heart of exile, a new way of being was born. Deprived of sacrifices, without a central priesthood, without the ritual machinery of the temple, the exiles began to gather in small communities, to study the texts, to recount aloud the stories of their ancestors. What had once been read by priests began to circulate as communal memory. Public readings were organized, debates held, interpretations shared. The figure of the scribe and the teacher began to rise in importance. A form of Judaism emerged that could survive without temple, without king, without land. A Judaism built on words, on memory, on cultural resistance. At the same time, the prophets continued to speak. Jeremiah, who had witnessed the fall of Jerusalem, wrote from grief, from anguish, but also from hope. Ezekiel, from within exile, had powerful and strange visions in which the glory of God was no longer anchored to a specific place. It moved, it accompanied, it survived the flames. It was a theological revolution. For the first time in Israel's history, it was understood that the divine presence was not limited to a physical space, that the covenant could remain alive even in exile, even in total loss. In Babylon, the exiles were not treated as faceless slaves. Some prospered, integrated into the economy, gained influence, but they did not dissolve. Jewish identity became something interior, stronger than borders. Faith, now stripped of all ceremonial structure, became a way of seeing the world, of remembering the invisible. The language, the stories, the genealogies, the observance of the Sabbath, the purity laws, these were preserved, debated, and passed down, not as a dead tradition, but as a way to survive with dignity. And then came the unexpected turn. In the year 539, the Babylonian Empire was conquered by Cyrus, king of Persia. And this new monarch, in a gesture that would change history, allowed the exiled peoples to return to their lands of origin, among them, the Jews. The decision was celebrated as a political miracle, but also as the fulfillment of prophecy. The possibility of returning to Jerusalem, of rebuilding the temple, of reorganizing religious life in the land of the ancestors, rekindled a hope that had seemed buried. However, not everyone returned. Many had already settled, had taken root in Babylon, and chose to stay. That choice marked the beginning of the diaspora as a permanent phenomenon. From that moment on, the Jewish people would live in multiple places at the same time, with a dispersed, complex, and yet coherent identity. And thus, what began as catastrophe gave way to a new form of existence. Exile did not destroy the people. It redefined them. It forced them to look inward, to build a portable spirituality, resilient, capable of crossing centuries and borders. Because when all that is visible is lost, what remains is memory. And when memory becomes action, study, and community, then no destruction is ever total. The next stage would be built among ruins and hopes, between partial returns and new threats. Because the return, though symbolically powerful, would bring with it challenges that would once again test the essence of a people who, against all odds, refused to disappear. The return to Jerusalem. When the Hebrew people were expelled from their land, it was not only their cities, their walls, and their rituals that were dismantled. The way they had learned to view the world was also shattered. The identity that had been centered around the temple, the priesthood, the land, and the festivals rooted in Jerusalem had been replaced by a life of displacement, of memory, of active nostalgia. Yet in that space of exile, where the soul seemed to be on pause, a new possibility began to take shape. The chance to rebuild not only walls and columns, but a different relationship with their own destiny. The final blow to Babylon came in the form of an imperial shift. Persia, with a broader and more pragmatic vision, absorbed the power that Babylon had accumulated over decades. And with that new power came a new approach. King Cyrus, regarded in Jewish tradition as a divine instrument, decreed that the deported peoples could return to their homelands. It was not an act of gratuitous kindness, but rather a strategy of imperial administration. Allowing nations to rebuild their local cults would bring stability, loyalty, and fewer conflicts. But for the Jews exiled in foreign lands, that decree felt like an unexpected opening in the heavens. The first to return were not the wealthiest or the most powerful. They were the convinced ones. Those who had spent generations speaking of Jerusalem as if they still walked its streets. Those who knew more through stories than direct experience, but who did not hesitate to begin the journey. And what they found upon arrival was not a holy city waiting for them intact. It was a ruin, a land covered in dust, burned fragments, an absence that hurt more because of the hope that had preceded it. Reconstruction was not a spiritual task. It was physical, exhausting, raw, and yet they undertook it. Zerubbabel, a descendant of the ancient royal house of David, led the first stage of the return, not as a king, for there was no longer a throne, but as the visible leader of a dispersed community in need of direction. Alongside him were the priests, some elders who still remembered the former structure, and the younger ones, who looked at the rubble with eyes fixed on the future. The first goal was clear: to restore the temple. There could be no nation without that center. But it would not be like the first one. It would not have the gold of Solomon, nor the ivory ornaments, nor the majesty of the glorious days. The new temple would be more modest, more functional, more contained. And yet, when the foundations were laid, the people wept. The elders, for remembering what had been. The young, for imagining what might come. The construction was not linear. There was opposition from neighboring peoples, internal tensions, scarcity of materials and energy. Some began to doubt. Others redirected their efforts toward rebuilding their own homes. Prophetic intervention was necessary to rekindle the effort. Haggai and Zechariah, each from their own voice, called on the people not to forget that this endeavor was not merely architectural, but existential. And finally, through collective effort, the second temple was completed. Not equal to the first, but strong enough to once again center religious life in Jerusalem. Years later, with the situation somewhat more stable, new figures arrived who would define the course of this rebirth. Among them, two stood out with distinct strength: Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra was a scribe, a man of letters and faith, who understood that without law, without education, without the precise transmission of the legacy, reconstruction would be hollow. It was he who organized public readings of the Torah, who reintroduced study as an essential part of daily life. Not as an activity for the elite, but as a communal habit, as a way to remain connected with the divine even without constant priestly mediation. Because what the people had learned in exile was that the relationship with God could be sustained through text, through repetition, through interpretation. Nehemiah, for his part, came from a different world. He was an official of the Persian court, with administrative, diplomatic, and logistical skills. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, he found a city still vulnerable, without walls, without defensive organization. He did not focus on the temple, but on its surroundings. He raised walls, organized guard shifts, physically protected the newly reclaimed space. His task was more pragmatic, but no less spiritual. For without defense, memory too can be destroyed. The collaboration between Ezra and Nehemiah represented a new balance, that of the pen and the sword, the text and the action, the inner and the outer. Through them, a new way of living the faith was solidified, more centered on the law, more rooted in the community, more dependent on study and less on animal sacrifice. The synagogue, which had begun to emerge in exile, became established as a place of gathering, reading, and shared interpretation. But not everything was harmonious. With the return came deep questions about identity. Who was part of the people? Who could be integrated? What should be done with those born from mixed marriages during the exile? Ezra, with a strict stance, demanded separation. There was fear of dilution, of loss of identity. Men were asked to separate from their foreign wives. It was not a gentle decision, nor free from pain, but it revealed a latent fear that the dispersion was not only geographical, but also spiritual. that the return might become a new starting point tainted by foreign influences. Amid those tensions, the community managed to stabilize. The Second Temple began to function normally. The festivals were resumed. The reading of the Torah acquired a central place, and Jerusalem, though lacking its former glory, once again breathed as a spiritual capital. The experience of exile had left an indelible mark, and that mark translated into a new awareness, that of a people who no longer depended exclusively on material structures, who had learned to carry their identity in memory, in study, in the weekly rhythm of the Sabbath, in the sanctification of the everyday. That Judaism, renewed but not reborn, would move forward in the following centuries with a constant mixture of resistance, adaptation, and vigilance. Because if anything had become clear in that time, it was that history did not guarantee stability, that every achievement could become a new breaking point, and that empires continued to move, drawing trade routes and borders without considering the sacred narratives of those who lived under their shadow. What would come later would not be lasting peace. New conquerors would arrive, new threats, new internal tensions. But for now, the people were back. Not whole, not triumphant, not resolved, but present. And that mere presence, in a city rebuilt stone by stone, was already a declaration of permanence. Because it had been proven that kingdoms, temples, armies, and thrones could fall. But as long as there remained a community willing to read, to remember, and to rebuild, the story did not end. It only changed its form. The resistance against the Greeks, the return to the ancestral land had provided a moment of respite, a point of restart, a flame that still burned among the ruins. The temple had been rebuilt, the law was once again central, and the community, smaller and more vulnerable than before, was reconstructing its core through text, practice, and memory. But that fragile stability could not shield itself from the world moving forward around it, because history does not pause to contemplate the rebuilding of peoples. Time moved on, and with it came new empires, new languages, new ways of exercising power. After the fall of the Persian Empire, it was the relentless advance of Alexander the Great that completely reshaped the map of the ancient East. His army, swift, disciplined, charismatic, swept away the old balances and, in a matter of years, brought Greek culture from Macedonia to India. But the force of his conquest was measured not only in battles won, but in an idea: Hellenization. Wherever they arrived, the Greeks not only imposed political control, but sought to reshape customs, education, architecture, rituals, and language. To be part of the Hellenistic world meant, at its core, to think and live like a Greek. When Alexander died, his empire fractured among his generals. Palestine was left in an ambiguous position, caught between two emerging powers: the Ptolemies, based in Egypt, and the Seleucids, ruling from Syria. For a time, the tension was more political than religious. The Jews, accustomed to adapting to shifting politics, retained a certain degree of autonomy. They could continue practicing their faith, their festivals, their language. But subtle changes began to seep in. Greek words in the markets, Greek names in wealthy families, theaters and gymnasiums in the cities. Hellenic culture, with its visual appeal, refined philosophy, and sense of universality, began to penetrate even Jerusalem. For many, this influence was tolerable, even welcomed. The sectors closest to power saw Hellenization as a path to social advancement. Adapting was a way to survive and also to prosper. But for others, this process was not modernization, but dissolution. Because at the root, the Greek and Jewish worldviews were nearly irreconcilable. The former celebrated the body, spectacle, and the polis as the center of civic life. The latter focused on interiority, the sanctity of the law, the invisible nature of the sacred. Where the Greeks saw beauty, the Jews saw idolatry. Where the Jews saw tradition, the Greeks saw backwardness. everything exploded with Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a Seleucid king who took the Hellenizing project to a brutal extreme. In an attempt to standardize his empire, he decided to ban Jewish religious practices. He went far beyond politics. He canceled the Sabbath, outlawed circumcision, banned the reading of the Torah, and forced the sacrifice of pigs on altars dedicated to Zeus, even within the Jerusalem temple. The holiest place was transformed into a pagan sanctuary. This was not merely conquest, it was deliberate humiliation. The impact was devastating. This was no longer a clash of empires, but a direct assault on identity. Some gave in, others fled. But there was a group that chose the most dangerous path: rebellion. In a small village called Modiin, an elderly priest named Mattathias was confronted by Seleucid envoys who demanded he offer sacrifices to the Greek gods. His response was a rupture. He killed the envoy and fled with his sons to the mountains. Thus began the resistance. It was not an army. It was made up of farmers, shepherds, young people with stones, knives, and iron determination. One of Mattathias' sons, Judah, assumed leadership. His nickname, the Maccabee, likely derived from an Aramaic word meaning hammer, reflected the forcefulness of his character. He organized ambushes, attacked garrisons, and employed guerrilla tactics against the Seleucid troops. Within a few years, he managed not only to halt the enemy, but to retake Jerusalem. And when they entered the temple, they found it desecrated, plundered, defiled with offerings to foreign gods. The purification of the temple became a foundational act. They lit the menorah, the sacred candelabrum, with the oil that remained, a small sealed flask, enough for just one day. And yet, according to tradition, the flame burned for 8 days. That gesture, beyond the miraculous details, was a declaration. The sacred fire would not be extinguished as long as there was a will to keep it burning. That event gave rise to the Festival of Hanukkah, which does not celebrate a military victory, but the rededication of a sacred space, the persistence of an identity under adverse conditions. Because what was at stake was not merely territorial control, but the possibility of continuing to exist, of not being lost in the imposed uniformity. And it was precisely that possibility that guided the years to come. After the victory, the family of the Maccabees, also known as the Hasmoneans, took power. For a time, they ruled with autonomy. A functioning temple existed once more, a central priesthood, their own coinage. But over time, power corrupted. Internal struggles, alliances with foreign powers, and fraternal conflicts for control gradually eroded the original drive of the revolt. What had begun as a spiritual defense eventually turned, in part, into a dynasty of political rather than religious ambition. Still, the Maccabean revolt left an indelible mark, because it showed that, even in an age of absolute domination, there was room to resist. That identity was not a static statue, but a living movement, capable of fighting, of adapting, of striking back. That memory, when turned into action, could open cracks even in the walls of the most sophisticated empires. That partial victory, however, did not guarantee stability. New international actors were approaching from the west. Rome was beginning to extend its tentacles across the Mediterranean, with a worldview as pragmatic as it was deadly. And amid the internal tensions of the Jewish people and the ambitions of external powers, the balance would again begin to fracture. The flame of the temple remained lit, but in the streets, in the mountains, in the public squares, new questions, new voices, and new groups began to emerge, debating the true meaning of the law, of the Messiah, of hope. And those debates would mark the beginning of an even more turbulent era, a time in which spirituality, politics, and survival would intertwine like never before. The world under Rome. When the Roman banners began to wave over the lands of Judea, They did not arrive accompanied by devastating armies or great fires. They arrived, as they often did, with treaties, with diplomacy, with promises of protection and order. It was a progressive occupation, silent at first, almost imperceptible, like a shadow stretching as the sun moves across the sky. And yet, over time, that shadow covered everything. Rome did not impose gods as Antiochus had done, nor did it force the people to openly renounce their ancestral faith. It knew that the religion of the Jewish people was resilient, stubborn, ancient, and that the memory of the Maccabean rebellion was still alive with force. That is why it preferred a more sophisticated form of control, to respect appearances, to keep the temple functioning, but to ensure that the true power resided elsewhere. Thus, under the veneer of religious autonomy, a system of surveillance, taxation, and subjugation flourished, slowly wearing down the pillars of the social and spiritual structure of Judea. The local kings, such as Herod the Great, were contradictory figures. Herod, in particular, built, embellished, and invested in colossal works. The temple was remodeled under his supervision and reached impressive dimensions, surrounded by terraces, courtyards, and gigantic walls. But that grandeur came at a price: complete submission to Roman power, a deep network of corruption, ruthless surveillance, and a total disconnection from the common people. Herod was hated by many, feared by all, and his death, far from easing tensions, opened a period of even greater fragmentation. Judea was divided not only in terms of political power, but in the deepest layers of its social fabric. Religious factions multiplied. There were the Pharisees, scholars of the law, committed to a daily life marked by purity, by the detail of the rules, by a meticulous fidelity to the text. Their strength did not lie in palaces, but in synagogues, in villages, in teaching. Opposite them were the Sadducees, priestly aristocrats clinging to control of the temple, allied with Rome, defenders of an ancient order that was losing legitimacy. There were also the Essenes, withdrawn into secluded communities, writing, waiting, purifying themselves from the chaos of the world. And at the other extreme, the Zealots, armed radicals who dreamed of war, of ending foreign rule, of a warrior Messiah who would cleanse the land with the sword. In the midst of this fragmented and tense landscape, a rumor arose, then a voice, then a name. A preacher from Galilee, accompanied by fishermen and artisans, walking from village to village, speaking of justice, of mercy, of a kingdom that was not of this world. Jesus of Nazareth. His figure, whether historical or not, forever transformed the narrative. For although his message was initially directed to his own people, what arose around him took a different course. The conflict was not only religious, it was political, it was social, it was human. The story of Jesus, seen from the Jewish perspective of the time, was one among many other messianic figures who appeared in those turbulent years. Men who proclaimed a final truth, who promised freedom, who denounced the hypocrisy of the powerful. Some were silenced after a short time. Others gathered followers and were then captured, executed, and forgotten. But the case of Jesus took an unexpected path, partly because of the impact of his death, and partly because of what his disciples began to proclaim afterwards. His figure became universal, and the nascent Christianity began to separate from its Jewish roots, not without tensions and traumas. The result was a new movement that, over time, would expand, conquer empires, and transform the relationship between Rome and the people from which it had emerged. But meanwhile in Judea, the tension continued to grow. Taxes were unbearable. Roman soldiers patrolled the streets. The priestly power was co-opted. And nationalist fervor was fueled by the memory of ancient victories, by the promise of redemption, by the messianic hope that burned, especially among the poorest. The population was divided, but they shared the same anguish. Something was about to explode. The Romans, accustomed to crushing revolts in the provinces, saw Judea as a rebellious, difficult, and unpredictable land. But what began to take shape around the year 66 was not an isolated revolt. It was a massive uprising, a declaration of dignity. The cities rose up. Garrisons were attacked. The temple, for the first time in centuries, was free of foreign intervention. For a brief moment, it seemed that history was repeating itself, as in the time of the Maccabees. But the enemy was no longer a weakened kingdom of the north. It was Rome. And Rome did not forgive. General Titus, son of Emperor Vespasian, was sent with full legions. There was no negotiation. There was no diplomacy. There was siege. Months of hunger, of despair, of violence between internal factions. Jerusalem became a deadly trap, and when the walls fell, they did so with a crash that still echoes in ancient texts. The temple was burned, its stones dismantled, its sacred objects looted and taken to Rome. The menorah, ancestral symbol, was carved into the Arch of Titus as a trophy. The spiritual capital of the Jewish people was reduced to ashes. That destruction in the year 70 was not only the end of a structure, it was the beginning of a profound transformation. For Judaism, deprived of its center, survived once again. This time not as a priesthood nor as a kingdom, but as a network of sages, of schools, of dispersed communities. The world changed, but the story, once again, did not end. It simply found another way to keep breathing. And as the rubble cooled and the communities withdrew, in another corner of the empire, a current was emerging that would reinterpret those events with a new reading. A current that would elevate one of the sons of the people as a divine figure, and that, over time, would adopt the cross as a symbol of salvation. But that story, although related, was no longer exactly the same. It was a fork in the road, and the path of the Jewish people, from then on, would have to learn to walk among the echoes of a divided identity. The fall of the Second Temple. After the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, what remained was a city wrapped in the dust of silence. There was no longer music at the gates, nor incense on the altars, nor priestly voices offering blessings from the sanctuary. What had once been a point of unity, a space where heaven seemed to touch the earth, had been reduced to a mountain of hot stones. But the collapse of the columns was not the immediate end. It was the beginning of a slow and painful tearing apart. The fall of the Second Temple marked the end of an era. For centuries, the religious, political, and social life of the Jewish people had revolved around that sacred space. Every pilgrimage, every celebration, every important prayer ended there. The destruction of that heart left the entire body trembling. But even in the midst of collapse, new pieces began to move, as if history refused to come to a complete halt. Rome, after its victory, imposed brutal conditions. Judea was declared an imperial province. The reconstruction of the temple was forbidden. Taxes were reinforced, and permanent garrisons were established to suppress any attempt at rebellion. The city was disfigured. Years later, after another uprising, Emperor Hadrian decided to completely erase the name of Jerusalem, replacing it with Aelia Capitolina, a Roman colony built upon the ruins of the Holy City. A sanctuary to Jupiter was erected on the Temple Mount. It was more than repression. It was an attempt to erase memory. But memory cannot be erased by decree. The history of this people had already shown that spirituality did not depend solely on bricks and altars. Even during the exile in Babylon, many wise men had learned to preserve faith in the diaspora, to sustain identity through texts, study, and oral transmission. Now, that experience became indispensable. As the priests disappeared from the scene and sacrifices faded into memory, the sages, the teachers of the law, and the interpreters of tradition emerged with greater strength. In small scattered communities, in Galilee, in Babylon, in distant hills and valleys, spaces for teaching and debate began to form. The synagogue, which had already existed as a place of gathering and prayer, came to occupy a central role. Judaism left behind its most ritualistic and priestly expression to enter a deeply intellectual and communal stage. The moment of transition was complex. Many resisted the change. Some believed that without the temple, nothing made sense, that the covenant had been broken, that God had abandoned his people. But others, with a more daring vision, understood that this physical absence could be compensated by a more distributed, more intimate spiritual presence. And thus began one of the deepest transformations in religious history, the shift from a Judaism centered on the temple to a Judaism centered on the Word. It was not an immediate or unified process. Schools emerged, interpretive currents, intense debates. Some wanted to preserve every detail exactly as it had been transmitted. Others sought to adapt the teachings to the new reality, but all agreed on something essential. That study was now a form of resistance, a way of keeping the connection alive. The pages of the Torah, the sayings of the sages, the discussions about daily laws formed a new type of sanctuary, one that could not be destroyed by swords. Meanwhile, in the political sphere, tension continued to pulse beneath the surface. At the beginning of the 2nd century, a new attempt at rebellion once again ignited the spirits. It was the revolt of Bar Kokhba, a charismatic military leader who managed to recover territories, organize an army, and sustain a semi-autonomous government for 3 years. Many considered him the awaited Messiah. Prominent rabbis supported him. Hope once again shone in the eyes of thousands, but Rome responded with fury. The legions arrived in masses. Cities were razed. Hundreds of thousands died. The rebellion was crushed, and the consequences were even more devastating than after the destruction of the temple. Jewish people were forbidden from living in Jerusalem. Schools were closed. Religious practices were severely restricted. It was a deliberate attempt to suffocate culture, to erase roots, to stifle any possibility of resurgence. And yet, history once again took an unexpected turn. Instead of disappearing, the people withdrew, reorganized, became more silent, but more resilient. In Babylon, under Persian rule, rabbinical academies flourished where sages continued their debates, their compilations, their interpretations. From that effort emerged, over time, the Talmud, a monumental and complex work, full of voices, that captures the soul of a people who learned to argue in order to survive. The fall of the Second Temple, then, far from marking an end, gave way to a new stage. A stage without priests, but with sages. Without sacrifices, but with prayers. Without a single meeting place, but with hundreds of centers of study scattered around the world. It was a more dispersed Judaism, harder to control, but also more versatile, more profound, more resistant to the passing of time. The Romans built over the ruins, carved their victories into triumphal arches, and paraded with looted treasures as symbols of their power. But history, once again, did not surrender. Because as long as there was someone who remembered the verses, who debated a passage of the Mishnah, who taught a child to read ancient Hebrew, the ruin would continue to pulse like a seed. And so, in silence, in the midst of exile, identity was reinvented. Because in every corner of the empire, from Alexandria to Babylon, from Rome to Gaul, there was someone who raised their voice to say, "We are still here." Not beneath the columns of the temple, but among the margins of an open book. Where the word does not die, the story continues. And there were still many pages left to write. The sages of the Talmud. Amid ruins, prohibitions, and forced displacements, while the ancient empires celebrated their conquests, a quiet yet decisive transformation began to take root. not in palaces or temples, but in the humble homes of wandering teachers, in improvised study halls, in the voices that repeated, analyzed, and debated every word of tradition. It was the beginning of a new form of survival, not based on the sword or sacrifices, but on disciplined memory, precise language, and the persistence of thought. After the destruction of the Second Temple and the failure of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, Judaism faced an existential crossroads. The structure that had sustained it for centuries had vanished. There were no longer altars, priests, or a physical center to gather around. But something essential remained: the text. The Torah, the written law, was still alive, recited from memory, copied by hand, protected like a fragile and sacred heart. And alongside it endured the oral law, that network of teachings passed from generation to generation, which had never been fully fixed on parchment, but lived in the words of the sages. That was the starting point of a new cultural project: to preserve, organize, and expand that oral tradition, to adapt it to a world without a temple. It was in this context that the Mishnah emerged, a monumental work written toward the end of the 2nd century, under the direction of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. The Mishnah was not a narrative, nor a story, nor a simple rule. It was an organized collection of legal debates, practical decisions, ethical thoughts, and commentary on all aspects of Jewish life. From how to eat, to how to pray, how to trade, how to marry, or how to resolve a legal dispute. Each section, each line, reflected centuries of discussions, echoes of voices that had debated under the shadow of exile. But the Mishnah did not close the conversation. On the contrary, it opened it. Because its language was precise, compact, full of unspoken assumptions. It demanded interpretation, expansion, and contrast. And that is exactly what happened in the following centuries, when generations of rabbis in different regions began to build commentaries around the Mishnah. That process gave rise to an even more complex work, the Talmud. In fact, there was not one, but 2 Talmuds. The Jerusalem Talmud, developed in the land of Israel under difficult conditions and Roman surveillance, and the Babylonian Talmud, composed in more stable circumstances, thanks to the tolerance of the Sassanid Empire. The latter, more extensive and detailed, eventually became the central pillar of Jewish thought. But beyond their differences, both represented something unprecedented: a universe of discussion, a living encyclopedia of the collective soul of a dispersed people. The Talmud is not a book to be read from beginning to end. It is a labyrinth of ideas, a constellation of voices that cross, interrupt, contradict, and enrich one another. In its pages, the most rigorous legal analysis coexists with fantastic tales, medical observations, philosophical reflections, and descriptions of everyday life. The sages discuss how many candles to light for a festival, but also the soul, time, and the meaning of justice. Every line is a dialogue with the past, but also a challenge to the reader, to understand, to respond, to continue the debate. And that debate did not happen in solitude. Around the study of the Talmud, academies were formed, circles of sages, entire communities dedicated to unraveling each word. The main schools of Babylonia, such as Sura and Pumbedita, became nerve centers of Jewish thought for centuries. There, law was not only discussed, leaders were trained, disputes were resolved, and communities separated by thousands of kilometers remained united by a shared spiritual language. This stage marked the birth of Rabbinic Judaism, in which the sages, not the priests, were the central authority. A Judaism that no longer depended on a sacred place, but on a shared text. In a world without political unity, without an army or sovereignty, the oral law, now transformed into written commentary, became the backbone of identity. Where once there was a temple, now there was a library. Where once there was an altar, now there was a study table. And although it may seem improbable, this model was what allowed Jewish identity to survive millennia of exile, persecution, forced migrations, and cultural shifts. Because the Talmud did not only teach laws, it taught how to think, how to question, how to argue without destroying the other, how to live with multiple points of view. It taught that truth is not always singular or immediate, and that understanding something deeply can take an entire lifetime. In times of intolerance and absolutism, that way of thinking was, in itself, a revolution. Meanwhile, Jewish life outside Babylonia continued to develop. In North Africa, in Persia, in the Arabian Peninsula, small communities began to shape their own versions of what they had learned, adapting it to their contexts, but always returning to that common text. The Talmud functioned as a spiritual genetic code, passed down even when conditions were hostile, even when sages were persecuted or texts were forbidden. The Judaism of the Talmud was not homogeneous. Within it lived diverse currents, different styles, unresolved contradictions. But perhaps that was its greatest strength, because instead of seeking a single voice, it allowed for many. Instead of imposing a closed dogma, it opened paths for interpretation. And that openness is what allowed the tradition to withstand the passage of time without breaking. In every generation, new students, new teachers, new questions. The Talmud is not a relic, but an infinite conversation. Every line is written with the memory of those who came before, but also with the urgency of those who are alive now. And it is precisely that continuity that kept Jewish identity burning across the centuries. The pages were not merely ink on parchment. They were spaces of gathering, of refuge, of resistance. Because even if empires fell, even if edicts changed, as long as someone was reading aloud, someone was responding. Someone was debating a passage written centuries earlier. The story kept breathing. And so, between columns of text and margins filled with notes, the people once again found a way to endure. And amid this new kind of strength, while the academies flourished in distant lands, other destinies, other routes, and other horizons began to open for those who were still to cross deserts, to cross seas, and to cross as well the invisible edge of the unknown. The Middle Ages in Sefarad in Europe. As the Jewish people entered the Middle Ages, their history took multiple paths at once, like rivers branching off without losing their common source. While the Talmud flourished in Babylon and the academies kept the conversation alive, a new geography began to shape the destiny of hundreds of communities, vast Christian Europe and the expanding Islamic world. There, amid suspicion, prestige, expulsion, and splendor, one of the most contradictory, complex, and fascinating periods of this long journey unfolded. In the lands ruled by Islam, particularly on the Iberian Peninsula, Judaism found for several centuries a space of respite, of partial integration, even of intellectual greatness. Sefarad, the Hebrew name for Spain, became an unparalleled cultural center. Under the rule of caliphs such as the Umayyads of Cordoba, the Jews were not merely tolerated. They could serve as court physicians, advisors, translators, poets, philosophers. The coexistence of Jews, Muslims, and Christians, although never free of tension, created an environment ripe for the exchange of ideas and for the flourishing of arts and thought. It was in this context that great figures emerged, such as Yehuda Halevi, a mystical and passionate poet who wrote verses in which the longing for Zion burned like an unquenchable fire, even amid the comfort of Al-Andalus. Or Maimonides, born in Cordoba in the 12th century, whose brilliant mind crossed the boundaries of Jewish thought to engage with Greek philosophy, Arab medicine, and pure reason. His work, The Guide for the Perplexed, remains to this day a monument to the synthesis of faith and reason, of tradition and rigorous analysis. But that golden age was not eternal. As the political balance crumbled and Islamic control retreated before the advance of the Christian kingdoms, the position of the Jews became more fragile. The same courts that once protected them began to look upon them with suspicion, pressured by religious sectors that saw them as perpetual heretics, guilty of rejecting Christ and of stubbornly remaining different. Passive tolerance turned into control. Control turned into surveillance, and surveillance into open persecution. On the other side of the continent, in the Christian kingdoms of the north, the situation was no better. In France, Germany, England, and other regions, Jews lived in ghettos, separated from the rest of the population, subjected to special laws, prohibitions, and additional taxes. They were useful because they could read, because they could count, because they could serve as moneylenders when the church forbade Christians from doing so. But they were useful as tools, not as citizens. And when religious hatred overflowed, as it did during the Crusades, Jewish communities became easy targets. Massacre after massacre, without trial, without mercy. One of the most tragic moments occurred during the First Crusade, at the end of the 11th century. While thousands of Christian soldiers marched toward the Holy Land to liberate the tomb of Christ, many of them made a bloody stop in the cities of the Rhine, where Jews had lived for generations. In Mainz, Worms, Speyer, and other cities of the valley, synagogues were burned, families executed, sacred scrolls destroyed. Not out of political strategy, but out of theological hatred. Because for many, Jews were not just different. They were those who had denied the incarnate God. And that, in the medieval mindset, was unforgivable. The church, at its highest levels, sometimes tried to protect the Jews. Popes such as Innocent III decreed that they should not be forced to convert, that they should be allowed to live in peace. But those words rarely translated into action when fanaticism took hold in the streets. Pogroms were repeated. Accusations of sacrilege, of poisoning wells, of murdering Christian children for rituals, completely unfounded accusations, circulated as absolute truths. And in the face of doubt, collective punishment became the response. But even amid such hostility, Jewish communities did not dissolve. On the contrary, many developed an intense internal life, with their own courts, their schools, their customs, their ways of interpreting the law. The tradition continued to be passed down from generation to generation. Commentaries on the Talmud were written. Legal codes such as Mishneh Torah by Maimonides and the Shulchan Aruch by Yosef Karo were compiled. New liturgical poetry was sung. Life was lived in fear, but also with fervor. In Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and Lithuania, where the Jewish presence grew as they were expelled from the West, robust, self-managed communities began to form with their own structures. There, the figure of the rabbi took on a central role, not only as a spiritual leader, but as a legal guide, mediator, protector, and living symbol of continuity. The yeshiva, the school for religious study, became the soul of the shtetl, that small Jewish universe within the Christian world. But in the Iberian Peninsula, the balance was broken in a more dramatic way. In the year 1391, a series of pogroms shook Spain. Hundreds of communities were attacked, thousands of Jews murdered or forced to convert. Thus was born the figure of the converso, the baptized Jew, often converted against their will, whose life became a nightmare of suspicion. Because even after baptism, many continued practicing in secret. And that was, in the eyes of the inquisitors, a double heresy. Traitors to Christ and traitors to their conversion. The Spanish Inquisition, founded in the year 1478, devoted itself obsessively to persecuting these crypto-Jews. With techniques of torture, confessions extracted by force, and trials without defense, the accused were condemned for maintaining the faith of their ancestors. And the state apparatus, driven by religious and economic interests found in the Jews and in the suspicious conversos, an ideal target for asserting its power. This escalation culminated in the year 1492 with the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Those who did not convert had to leave the country, abandoning their homes, their books, their dead. Many died on the journey. Others were welcomed in the Ottoman Empire, in North Africa, in Italy, in the Netherlands. But the blow was devastating. A culture that had flourished for centuries was dismantled in a matter of weeks. Even so, Sefarad did not disappear from the Jewish soul. It became both a wound and a luminous memory. The Sephardim, as the descendants of that diaspora would come to be known, preserved their language, their music, their liturgy. Ladino, that medieval Spanish with Hebrew and Arabic inflections, continued to be heard in the salons of Istanbul, in the synagogues of Salonika, in the courtyards of Jerusalem. The memory of a lost land became a source of identity, fuel for resistance and reconstruction. Meanwhile, in Central and Eastern Europe, the Ashkenazi communities continued writing their own history, with their own customs, their own Yiddish, their own way of singing prayers. Two branches of the same tree, separated by history, but nourished by the same sap. And thus, between expulsions, wisdom, violence, and poetry, the people moved forward. Empires changed, languages changed, but the voice kept repeating the ancient texts, as if within them were hidden not only the past, but also a promise. Because the journey was not yet over, and the coming century would bring with it new questions, new doors, and once again, new threats. The expulsion and the forced exile, the history of the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula after centuries of cultural splendor, of poetry, of philosophy and science, eventually shattered in one of the most painful episodes of their long journey. What had been Sefarad, a fertile land for thought and spirituality, became, over time, and with the hardening of religious power, the stage for a calculated purge. The bonfires of the Inquisition consumed not only bodies, but entire libraries, invisible legacies, generations of memory. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain in the year 1492 was neither an isolated nor an impulsive act. It was the result of an accumulation of tensions, fears, and manipulations that had been brewing for decades. After the pogroms of the year 1391, thousands of Jews were forced to convert to Christianity, forming a new social and spiritual group, the conversos. But their conversion, often forced and lacking genuine conviction, generated more distrust than integration. Instead of resolving the so-called Jewish problem, it relocated it within Christianity itself, where these new Christians were seen as suspicious, as disguised heretics, as dangerous infiltrators. It was on this foundation of suspicion that the Inquisition was born. Under the excuse of defending the purity of the Catholic faith, a mechanism of surveillance and punishment was deployed that persecuted not only differing beliefs, but intentions. An anonymous accusation, an inappropriate comment, a candle lit on a Saturday, was enough to activate a machine that operated in the shadows, with interrogations, torture, confiscation of property, and sentences that allowed no appeal. Fear became the norm. Denunciation became the currency. But for the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, that repression was not enough. In a kingdom that aspired to political, religious, and linguistic unity, the existence of a minority faithful to its own codes was an ideological obstacle. And so, in March of the year 1492, the Edict of Expulsion was signed. All Jews had to leave the kingdom within 3 months. They could take their belongings, but not gold, nor silver, nor anything of substantial economic value. The soul could be saved, they said. The body had to pay. More than 100,000 people were forced to choose between faith or exile. Some converted, pressured by fear or by the need to survive. Many others departed, abandoning their homes, their family graves, their sacred books. They left by sea, by land, along uncertain routes. Some went to Portugal, where they believed they would find refuge, but a few years later they too were persecuted and forced to convert. Others arrived in North Africa, where conditions were harsh and reception uncertain. But there was one destination that made a key difference: the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Bayezid II, upon hearing of the expulsion, welcomed the exiles with intelligence and strategy. "You call the kings of Spain wise, but how can they be wise if they impoverish their kingdom and enrich mine?" he is said to have remarked, according to some chronicles. The Sephardic Jews who arrived in Salonika, in Istanbul, in Smyrna, were received not only as refugees, but as valuable pieces of an imperial puzzle. There, far from the inquisitorial bonfires, they were able to rebuild their communities, their customs, their language, and their prayers. Ladino, that medieval Castilian fused with Hebrew and Arabic words, became the language of a diaspora that refused to forget. Synagogues bore the names of their cities of origin: the one from Toledo, the one from Burgos, the one from Zaragoza. Every prayer was also an evocation of what was lost. But far from living trapped in nostalgia, these Jews rebuilt a solid culture, with printing presses, with schools, with new rabbis and poets. In many cases, they preserved their documents, their genealogies, their recipes, as a way of continuing to belong to a world that no longer existed. Meanwhile, the conversos who had decided to remain in Spain lived under constant surveillance. Many of them, although Christians in public, continued to practice certain ancestral customs in secret: lighting a candle on Friday night, not eating pork, whispering prayers. This crypto-Judaism, though full of risks, became an act of spiritual resistance. Every hidden gesture was a way of affirming continuity in the midst of terror. The Inquisition did not vanish quickly. It operated for centuries, fueled by denunciations, by rumors, by the idea that the purity of faith must be protected at any cost. But what it persecuted was not so much a real enemy as a phantom created by power. The secret Jew became a symbolic figure of internal evil, of hidden betrayal, of the enemy within. And that allowed the authorities to justify their brutality with a narrative of defense. In the Americas, the consequences were soon felt. Many conversos crossed the ocean in search of new beginnings. Some fled the stigma, others sought economic opportunities. In some cases, Judaism survived, camouflaged behind false names and discreet practices. And for generations, there were families who continued repeating customs whose origins they had forgotten, but which were marked by centuries of fear. The Sephardic diaspora branched out across the Mediterranean, the Balkans, North Africa, the Netherlands. In Amsterdam, for example, a vibrant, open community was established, where for the first time in a long while, Jews could live without masks. There flourished thinkers like Baruch Spinoza, whose philosophy would challenge not only religious dogma, but the very notion of the divine. It was the reflection of an identity that, though wounded, refused to dissolve. And meanwhile, the memory of Sefarad did not fade. It became a symbol, a myth, an open wound passed from parents to children. The names of the Spanish cities remained in the prayers, the melodies in the liturgy, the surnames in the documents. The story of the expulsion was not just a forced migration. It was an emotional fracture, a cultural rupture that left scars still pulsing in collective memory. But it was also a moment of reinvention, because in every port where a Sephardic Jew settled, a new synagogue opened, a new candle was lit, a new generation was taught. And although the paths were uncertain, and the borders sometimes treacherous, identity kept moving, like the wind, like music, like the words of a language that seemed to defy time. And so, after the expulsion, exile ceased to be a temporary condition. and became a form of existence. Being Jewish was no longer just about belonging to a land or a language, but to a shared story, to a memory that adapted without surrender. What was lost in Sefarad was reborn in Istanbul, in Salonika, in Fez, in Amsterdam, in the Caribbean, in Lima. In every corner where someone remembered, the flame remained alive. The world kept changing. New empires rose, new ideas spread across Europe. And amid those winds of transformation, the Jews would once again face promises of inclusion that would often end in new forms of exclusion. Because modernity did not bring only freedom, it also brought harder questions, deeper contradictions, and dangers still waiting to erupt. Emancipation, Enlightenment, and modern antisemitism. For centuries, the condition of the Jew had been clear, though brutal. He was the perpetual outsider, the tolerated subject, the visibly different one. In Christian lands, he lived in ghettos, bore special taxes, was set apart by law, and marked by religion. There was no ambiguity. The marginalization was explicit. But starting in the 18th century, as Europe stirred under the lights of reason, freedom, and the critique of absolutism, something new emerged: the promise of equality. The European Enlightenment had begun as a revolution of ideas. The old feudal structures were beginning to crumble, and thinkers like Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, and many others championed a world guided by reason, science, and the rights of the individual. In that context, an inevitable question arose: what place should the Jew occupy in the new enlightened society? For many, the answer seemed obvious. He should be emancipated. That is, he should cease to be a distinct legal figure and become an equal citizen, equal before the law, free to pursue professions, to live wherever he chose, to participate in politics. This idea, which at first seemed like a genuine gesture of integration, carried a trap. The Jew had to renounce his difference, become a neutral subject, abandon his visible symbols, dissolve his identity into the national body. He was not to be Jewish above all, but French, German, Austrian, and if possible, not show it too much. The French Revolution was a pioneer in this process. In the year 1791, the National Assembly granted full citizenship to the Jews. For the first time, they were not considered a separate community, but individuals with the same rights as everyone else. But behind that progressive measure lay a silent demand. Citizenship was a contract that required the Jew to stop being a people within a people, to become invisible. In many cases, this integration generated enthusiasm. Brilliant figures emerged: doctors, lawyers, scientists, writers. Universities opened their doors. Civil marriages were allowed. Some even entered parliament. But while one part of the Jewish world embraced this modernity with optimism, another part experienced it with unease. What was lost in joining that game? What remained of tradition, of community, when each person was expected to act as an isolated individual, disconnected from their collective roots? And there was another, deeper layer, less visible, but just as real: the reaction. Because for many conservative sectors of Europe, the emancipated Jew was a threat. No longer the excluded other, but the other who looked too similar. He competed in commerce, in politics, in culture. He could succeed. And that success unleashed a new form of hatred: modern antisemitism. Unlike the old theological hatred, which accused the Jews of killing Christ or rejecting the gospel, this new hatred wore secular clothing. It disguised itself as pseudoscience, nationalism, or economic theory. Jews were now portrayed as a different race, a Semitic race, incompatible with the national identity. They were seen as usurers, manipulators of capital, infiltrators exploiting the system, or, according to other narratives, as revolutionaries who wanted to destroy everything. They were bankers and Bolsheviks, depending on whom you asked. The only constant was the idea that they could never truly belong to the nation. In Germany, this tension became especially evident. Throughout the 19th century, German Jews managed to integrate at impressive levels. They contributed decisively to philosophy, science, and music. Figures like Heinrich Heine, Moses Mendelssohn, and later Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud transformed the European intellectual world. And yet, there was always an invisible line that could not be crossed, a tacit limit that reminded them that, no matter how brilliant they were, their belonging was conditional. Moses Mendelssohn, whom many consider the father of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, defended the idea that one could be both Jewish and a modern citizen. He translated the Bible into German, promoted educational reforms, and encouraged dialogue with Christian thinkers. But his dream of full coexistence was constantly challenged by a harsher reality, in which prejudice did not die. It mutated. In Eastern Europe, the situation was even more complicated. Jews lived in closed communities with little integration under autocratic regimes that permitted, and sometimes encouraged, pogroms. In the Russian Empire, anti-Jewish edicts were systematic. Their mobility was restricted, access to education was limited, and participation in economic life was curtailed. In the year 1881, after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, a wave of pogroms broke out, leaving thousands dead without any justice. The state, far from stopping the violence, legitimized it. For many, that was the final sign that modern antisemitism could be as brutal as the medieval one, but with a more sophisticated institutional mask. It was in this context that new responses began to emerge within the Jewish world. Some turned back toward religion. Others sought total integration. But a radically different idea also took root. If the world would not accept Jews as full citizens, then they needed to reclaim a place of their own, a land, a nation. Zionism was being born, not from euphoria, but from accumulated despair. But that was yet to crystallize. Meanwhile, in France, the Dreyfus Affair exposed all the contradictions of modernity. Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish captain in the French army, was falsely accused of treason. The press condemned him without evidence. The state publicly disgraced him. And although his innocence was later proven, the scandal divided the entire society. For many Jewish intellectuals, it was irrefutable proof that, no matter how modern, how patriotic, how discreet they were, suspicion still lingered. Hatred no longer needed theology. It was enough to have a different last name, or a face that did not quite fit. The science of racism, the idea of ethnic purity, began to gain ground in academies and parliaments. And though decades remained before the absolute horror of the 20th century, the threads had already been spun. Modern antisemitism was not a leftover from the past. It was a new construction, adapted to the industrial age, capable of using statistics, biology, misinterpreted history, and legal language to dress prejudice in the garments of reason. And yet, amid all this, the Jewish world did not go dark. It transformed. In Berlin, Vienna, Prague, Warsaw, schools emerged. Publications were founded. Jewish social movements and political parties appeared, from Orthodox to Marxist. Debates flourished over the role of Hebrew, the value of Yiddish, and the possibility of creating a modern culture that did not renounce its origins. It was a profound, diverse, sometimes contradictory effervescence, but full of life. The promise of emancipation had been partial, and its shadows were becoming visible. But every step backward awakened new questions, new quests, new strategies. Jewish history thus entered the threshold of the 20th century, with the awareness that no place was completely safe, and that the modern world, no matter how rational it claimed to be, was capable of incubating monsters behind the mask of progress. And though decades of hope and horror, of foundation and destruction still lay ahead, what was coming had already begun to take shape in the margins of newspapers, in political manifestos, in banned books, and in clandestine meetings. Because the next chapter would not be a repetition, it would be a rupture, and it would forever change the course of history. The Holocaust. There are no words that suffice. No number, no figure, no image can fully encompass what happened during the years of the Second World War, in the hidden camps behind the forests of Poland, in the ditches of Ukraine, in the trains that snaked through Europe filled with living bodies that no longer had a destination. It was called Shoah. Devastation, total annihilation. And although human history is plagued with wars, massacres, and systematic cruelties, this was different. Because it was planned, because it was rational, because it was industrial. Antisemitism had mutated. It was no longer the prejudice of a neighborhood, the religious slander, or the speech of a street agitator. It had become a doctrine of the state, an ideology with a uniform, a flag, and school books. From its inception, Nazism had placed the Jew at the center of its narrative of the enemy. He was not just a social figure to be scorned. He was the one to blame for all evils, the one who degenerated culture, who destroyed the economy, who conspired in the shadows to weaken the German people. From their rise to power in the year 1933, Hitler and his collaborators began a systematic process to exclude the Jew from German life. First came laws. Bans on working in certain professions, restrictions on marriage, on studying, on inheritance. Then came public humiliations, book burnings, shops destroyed, license plates ripped off. The Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, in the year 1938, made clear that violence was no longer a threat. It was now active policy. When the war broke out in the year 1939 with the invasion of Poland, everything accelerated. The Jews in the occupied territories were confined to ghettos, closed-off zones surrounded by walls, where hunger, disease, and overcrowding did the rest. In Warsaw, in Lodz, in Krakow, thousands of families were packed into tiny spaces, with no heating, no regular food, no access to medicine. Many died there without ever having seen a concentration camp. Death, from the beginning, did not need gas chambers. But it was not only about expelling or confining. In the year 1941, after the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, a new phase began. Mass shootings, mobile death squads known as the Einsatzgruppen roamed villages and towns, gathered the Jews, forced them to dig trenches, and executed them en masse. Women, children, the elderly. The numbers are counted in the hundreds of thousands, and all with photographic records, administrative reports, with a coldness that horrifies more than the blood itself. But even that brutality was not enough for the leaders of the Nazi regime. They had to be more efficient, faster, more silent. Thus was born the so-called final solution. In January of the year 1942, in a villa on the outskirts of Berlin, the Wannsee Conference was held. There, senior government officials defined with bureaucratic precision how to exterminate 11 million European Jews. It was not an improvised illusion. It was a detailed plan. With trains, with schedules, with budgets. Mass deportations to concentration and extermination camps began. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, Belzec, Chelmno. Names that today sound like tragedy, but that at the time were merely coordinates, points on a map where horror was repeated over and over with almost mechanical logic. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the most emblematic of all, Trains arrived daily. Selections were carried out. Some went directly to the gas chambers. Others were sent to forced labor, with insufficient food, inadequate clothing, and no hope of surviving more than a few months. The methods were perversely rational. Zyklon B was used, a pesticide that killed hundreds of people in minutes when they were locked in. Bodies were incinerated. Gold teeth were extracted. Hair was collected. Remains were recycled. Statistics mattered more than tears. And yet, in the midst of it all, there was resistance. There was dignity. In the Warsaw Ghetto, an armed uprising resisted for weeks despite knowing defeat was inevitable. In the forests, groups of Jewish partisans sabotaged trains, attacked convoys, fled to form small hidden communities. There were rabbis who kept teaching in low voices, mothers who hid their children in false walls, farmers who sheltered entire families beneath the floors of their homes. There were diplomats who forged passports, priests who baptized Jewish children to save them, doctors who faked epidemics to prevent deportations. Every act of humanity in that hell became a form of victory, an affirmation that total brutality was not invincible. And when the war ended, when the Allies liberated the camps, what they found were not just corpses and ruins. They found empty gazes, bodies walking with skin clinging to their bones, diaries buried, testimonies written on scraps of paper. They found the survivors, those who did not know where to go, who had no home, no country, no family, no future. Military victory was not restitution. It was merely the beginning of mourning. More than 6 million Jews were murdered. The number is unbearable. But even harder is to grasp what that number represents. An entire generation gone. Entire communities erased. Languages, accents, songs, customs that no one will inherit. Towns that ceased to exist. Surnames that were never heard again. Interrupted projects, lives cut short. And yet, those who remained stood up. Many migrated to the United States, to Latin America, to Palestine. Some rebuilt their lives among the ruins of Europe. Others formed kibbutzim, collective farming communities, seeking a new existence where the future would not be conditioned by fear. But at every step, they carried with them the memory of those who were no longer there. The Holocaust is not just another chapter in the history of the Jewish people. It is a deep fracture in the history of humanity. It is a warning, an open question, an abyss that forces us to look directly at what we are capable of doing when we dehumanize the other. And at the same time, it is a testimony of resistance, of light amidst darkness, of people who chose to preserve their dignity even in the most extreme conditions. Because even there, where everything seemed to have been destroyed, there was someone who wrote a letter, someone who sang a song, someone who taught their child the meaning of a Hebrew word before dying. And as long as there is someone who remembers that, who says it out loud, who carries it into the world, that story will remain alive. After the inferno, there were still decisions to be made. Could one still be Jewish in a world that had allowed this? Could one trust again? Could something be rebuilt that was not founded on distrust? The answers would arrive soon, in a territory charged with promises and conflicts. Because the next step was not a pause, it was a declaration of existence. And with it, new battles would come. The State of Israel and Contemporary Identity. In 1948, in a modest room in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion stood up, read a carefully written text, and, without raising his voice, declared the birth of a state. The words were clear, brief, firm. We proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in Eretz Israel, which shall be known as the State of Israel. With that phrase, thousands of years of exile were compressed into a single moment. The ancestral yearning to return to the land of the forefathers had finally taken a legal, recognizable, sovereign form. It was a moment of euphoria, of historical redemption, of held-back tears. But it was also the beginning of a new complexity. The creation of the State of Israel was far more than the realization of the Zionist dream. It was a response to centuries of persecution, to the Shoah, to the systematic denial of belonging anywhere without fear. It was, in a way, the political translation of an existential impulse. If no one else wants us, if we cannot rely on others' promises, then we must build with our own hands the refuge that never existed. But that refuge was not built in a vacuum. It was established in a territory already inhabited, disputed, laden with history. Palestine, under British mandate since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, was already a crucible of tensions when the United Nations proposed in 1947 a partition plan. 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab. The Jewish community accepted. The Arab leaders did not. War followed immediately, raw and decisive. The day after the proclamation, the armies of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq attacked. But they failed to destroy the new state. Israel survived that first onslaught, and thus began its modern history, a history as full of hope as of conflict. Within the country, the massive arrival of Jewish immigrants from every corner of the world forever changed the human landscape. From displaced persons camps in Europe, from Yemeni villages, from Sephardic neighborhoods in North Africa, hundreds of thousands of people arrived, many with nothing, carrying scars on their bodies and in their memories. The newborn state had to build houses, schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and a national identity. It was a colossal task, but also an unrepeatable opportunity. However, with every step toward consolidation, another wound emerged, that of the Palestinians who had been expelled or had fled during the 1948 war. Around 700,000 people were left without land, without return, without recognition. And that rupture became an unresolved core issue that still shapes life in the region today. Because the creation of Israel meant salvation for many, but dispossession for others. And between those two truths, history began to tighten. In the following years, Israel had to face new wars. In 1956, in 1967, in 1973. In each one, military victory came at the cost of increased mistrust, isolation, and friction. In the Six-Day War, Israel took control of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai. That territorial expansion, which for many was a return to biblical sites, became for others an occupation. The founding narrative began to diverge. The hero for one part of the world was the oppressor for another. Meanwhile, within the country, Israeli society grew at a dizzying pace. First-rate universities, research centers, advanced agriculture, and an economy that went from precarious to among the most dynamic in the world. Hebrew, a language revived through the visionary efforts of Eliezer ben Yehuda, became the everyday language of millions. But with that development came new dilemmas. The tension between the secular and the religious, between democracy and the ethnic definition of the state, between the memory of victimhood and the exercise of power. The image of the Israeli soldier became a national symbol, young, educated, committed, but also subject to international criticism when military operations in occupied territories caused civilian casualties. The Palestinian intifadas, the attacks, the reprisals, the separation wall, the settlements. Each of these elements added layers to the conflict, making it increasingly difficult to separate justice from politics, history from the present, security from human rights. And yet, life in Israel is not just conflict. It is also art, film, music, science, endless debates in cafes, social movements demanding equality for Ethiopian Jews, for women, for Arab Israelis. It is tense pluralism, but real. It is a vibrant democracy that coexists with a permanent state of exception. It is a society that lives on the edge, that has not yet known lasting peace, but that has developed a unique capacity for adaptation, for innovation, for survival with dignity. Jerusalem, spiritual epicenter, has also become a microcosm of contradictions. In its streets live Orthodox Jews who refuse military service alongside secular youths developing startups. Palestinians working in Israeli hospitals alongside settlers who reject any notion of partition. Every stone has more than one story. Every prayer collides with another. Every flag stirs contradictory emotions. Meanwhile, the Jewish diaspora observes, supports, criticizes, torn between pride and discomfort. Because the state of Israel, while being a vital point of reference, does not represent everyone in the same way. Some see it as the tangible miracle of Jewish history. Others see it as a complexity that forces a rethinking of what it means to be Jewish today. Is Israel the inevitable center of identity? Can one feel part of a people without endorsing its politics? Where do ancestral history and contemporary ethics intersect? The answers are not simple. Because Israel, more than a country, has become a mirror. A space where the deepest dilemmas of modern Judaism are magnified. Universalism versus particularism, power versus morality, memory versus future. And that mirror at times hurts. But it also illuminates. Because despite all its contradictions, Israel has preserved something intact. Continuity. The possibility that an ancient language is spoken in the present. That a people without an army for 2,000 years now has supersonic jets. That the same calendar that guided harvests in the days of the temple is now used to schedule flights, elections, and holidays. It is a living paradox, a scar that is also a testimony. And although no one can predict how this story will continue, one thing is certain. Israel has forced the world to confront an uncomfortable, urgent, and inevitable question. Because after exile, after the Holocaust, after centuries of marginalization, the Jewish people did not ask for permission. They stood up. They took charge of their destiny. And in that profoundly human act, they put all their virtues and all their risks on the line. And the story has not ended. It has only become denser, more complex, more unavoidable. Because what is at stake is no longer only the past. It is how to live the present when history is alive. And what comes next is no longer built with ruins. It is built with decisions. And with questions that no one has yet fully answered. Fragmented identity. Somewhere in the world today, a child is learning to read Hebrew with the calm voice of their grandmother. In another city, a young woman prepares a Shabbat dinner without feeling religious, but knowing that something ancestral urges her to do it. On a university campus, a professor discusses Jewish history with students who are not entirely sure whether that history truly belongs to them. And in a neighborhood in Jerusalem, a group of ultra-Orthodox teenagers walks between prayers and mobile phones, between worlds that barely touch. This is how the story of the Jewish people continues, dispersed, vibrant, contradictory. Not as a straight line, but as a mosaic, an identity made of fragments. Because if anything has defined the last 70 years of Jewish life around the world, it has been multiplicity. There is no longer a single center, a central authority, or an undisputed tradition. There are thousands of ways to be Jewish, and almost as many discussions as there are people who dare to define themselves. In Israel, where history, religion, and politics are intertwined, the tension is constant. Can a Jewish state be, at the same time, democratic, pluralistic, and modern? What happens when religion dominates public spaces? What does it mean today to be Israeli before being Jewish, or the other way around? And across the ocean, in the diaspora, the questions are no simpler. In New York, in Paris, in Buenos Aires, in Toronto, or in Berlin, Jewish communities live surrounded by secular, globalized societies, increasingly distant from religious roots. The empty synagogues of Europe contrast with the growing study centers in Asia. The concern for continuity, that word that has followed the people since the Babylonian exile, now expresses itself in new terms: intermarriage, assimilation, loss of language, symbolic disappearance. And yet, there has never been so much Jewish creativity. In literature, in film, in philosophy, in art, in social activism. Books are published, podcasts are launched, debate spaces are opened where tradition is revisited from every possible angle. Some seek to return to the sacred text as a source of radical critique. Some recover Sephardic customs, Ladino songs, medieval recipes. Others organize encounters between Jews and Muslims, rebuilding broken bridges. Identity is no longer a silent inheritance. It is a daily construction. And even so, the fractures are evident. Between Orthodox and Reform Jews. Between those who unconditionally support the State of Israel and those who question it from within. Between those who believe that antisemitism is a thing of the past and those who feel it has returned with a new mask. The internet has connected, but it has also polarized. And amid so many voices, some feel alone, disoriented, unsure whether they belong, or if by not following the path others consider correct, they are betraying something. Language also divides and unites. Modern Hebrew unites Israel, but many communities in the diaspora barely know it. Yiddish, which was the soul of Ashkenazi life for centuries, struggles not to disappear. Ladino endures in some homes and songs, like an echo of Sefarad. Each language carries a way of thinking, a sense of humor, a worldview. To lose a language is to lose a way of feeling. And despite all that, the bond does not break. In times of crisis, when a synagogue is attacked, when a Jewish person is murdered for being Jewish, when history once again bares its teeth, the differences are suspended and identity reappears, not as dogma, but as intimate belonging, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes painful, but impossible to deny. Something deep within that says, this affects me, this touches me, even if I cannot explain why. And not everything is in the past. Many young Jewish people are searching for new ways to express their identity. They do not want to repeat old formulas, nor live under the shadow of tragedy. They want to build from the present. Create communities that include, that listen, that embrace complexity. Some return to study ancient texts, not out of faith, but out of curiosity, out of love for debate, out of a need to find roots in a fluid world. Others reclaim a cultural, musical, or philosophical identity, and each gesture, no matter how small, is a spark of continuity. Globalization has diluted borders, but it has raised deep challenges. How can collective memory be sustained without falling into empty folklore? How can new generations be educated without imposing the weight of the past, but also without abandoning them to oblivion? What kind of Judaism can emerge in a world where everything is in constant transformation? And perhaps the key lies there. Judaism has survived not because it stayed the same, but because it knew how to transform. From the prophets to the rabbis of the Talmud, from medieval philosophers to contemporary activists, there was always an impulse to reinterpret, to update without betraying the essence. And that essence, though difficult to define, has to do with the constant question, with active memory, with the desire for justice, and with the stubborn will to keep existing. Today, there are Jews who pray 3 times a day and others who never pray. There are those who eat kosher and those who do not know what that word means. There are those who celebrate the holidays out of tradition, out of family, out of love, out of nostalgia, out of commitment. There are those who break away from everything, and yet when Yom Kippur arrives, they feel a pang in their chest. Because identity is not always rational. Sometimes it is just a melody, a story told in childhood, a word that resonates. And in that sea of fragments, there is no single path. But there is one constant: the need to remember, to tell, to narrate again. Because as long as the story is told, as long as there is someone who asks, who is moved, who searches in the past for a guide to the present, identity is not lost. It is only transforming. The Jewish people, in the end, were never a closed category. They were a journey, an endless conversation, a fabric of voices that sometimes contradict each other, but never stop speaking. And as long as there is someone to listen, the story continues. Because ultimately, the question is not only what Judaism was, but what it can become. And the answer, as always, will depend on those who are willing to keep building it, letter by letter, generation after generation, without fear of debate, without fear of change, but also without fear of remembering. And so this narration ends, for now. Not as a final period, but as an open invitation. Because history, at its core, is a book that never closes. It only passes from hand to hand. If this journey moved you or made you reflect, leave your comment. I want to read you. Subscribe so you do not miss the next chapters that are already on their way. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Good night.